always a possibility of this work becoming much more abstract and much less accessible, much less reader-friendly. And academics, I'm sure people here on this side, on the other side, would agree with me, academics are known to complicate things for no reason, right? They just get a kick out of making our lives there. But that way, I think this book is definitely a fresh breath of air. It is lucid. It deals with matters that are very complicated. It deals with interfaces that are not easy to grapple with. But I must congratulate the author, the midwife, for kind of executing it in a way that is bordering impossible. It's very lucid, you read it and you get it, which is a rarity in the academic world. You have to really read a text again and again to get a hang of things, etc. So that is something that I wanted to. I also want to, I should have said this in the beginning. I'm not at the South Asian University anymore. Please, that's. I actually, my contract got over quite unceremoniously, I must say. So I'm not employed anywhere at the moment. I happen to be part of the unemployed lot of this country. Okay, so now let me just share with you a few things, because Parvez has already outlined some of the essentials, and I think in a very comprehensive way. But let me just share with you a few pointers in relation to specifically the introduction and a very lucidly, poignantly written chapter on politics around the sacred cow. So these are the two. I ended up reading 3 chapters, but in the interest of time, I'm going to speak about just 2. Introduction and this particular chapter, which is very enlightening, very revealing in terms of this entire politics around the sacred cow. So I might not be as coherent as I would want to be, but I hope you will bear with my incoherence. Now, just to, so in relation to the introduction, let us get this idea of what we call the practices of the state. It's a very interesting argument. It's a very interesting framing of a very important problem. So generally speaking, when we think of the state, we think of the state as an institution, and I'm sure those of you who have had some association with sociology, political science, history, broadly speaking social sciences, critical social science, etc., know this, that the state has been predominantly understood, talked about, discussed in very concrete, tangible terms, right, as a certain form of authority, etc., etc. But when we talk about practices of the state, we are actually pushing the discourse in markedly perceptive ways. And I'm reminded of a very interesting parallel, which is related to this anthropologist named David Morgan, who writes about family as an institution, and he uses this phrase called family practices. So he does not talk about family as a group of individuals who are related either by adoption or by blood or by marriage, right? He speaks about family as something that's to do with practices. So the long and short of it is, family is what family does, or family is what family members experience on a daily basis. Now, exactly the same way, state is not just something out there to be identified as a body, as a representative of some authority structure, etc., but state as entering into the day-to-day life of people. So the everyday life and its interface with the state is something that helps us get closer to this idea, what we call practice. So states practices in terms of looking at its everyday manifestations and not considering or not looking at or studying the state in a very routine, sort of conventional ways, right? So this phrase in itself, practices of the state, or state to be understood in terms of its practices, and particularly how does it interact with, how does it tackle the minority, or how does it interact with the margins, how does it engage with the margins, etc., etc. This is something that is, of course, it merits our attention, and we must sort of look into this as meticulously and as meditatively as possible. So this idea, I wanted to kind of foreground this, and the parallel, that I was reminded of David Morgan that we read many years ago when we were doing this compulsory course, Family, Marriage and Kinship. I'm also reminded of literature as a practice. I'm, of course, taking a detour, but it'll be just a minute long. So literature, not just, again, as a body, but literature as a practice. And you have people like Sartre and others who've written about literature. So literature is what literature does. So state is what state does, and state is not only to be defined in terms of a certain conventional political science wisdom, but also to be defined in terms of what it does on an everyday basis, particularly to those who are at the margins, right? Those who are at the periphery. So here comes the everyday. Now, the everyday, unfortunately, in social science circles has also been misused. And Tanveer Bhai knows very well what I am referring to. There are sociologists who have misused the everydayness to a point of no redemption, right? So there has been a blatant misuse of this everydayness. There's a lot of sociology of everyday going on these days. This is one of those best-selling tropes within sociology. But here I think the invocation, the usage, the overall application is much more exciting and it's much more perceptive. So this everyday, how does the state enter into our everyday? Now there are, so the introduction looks at, of course, because it's the introduction, it almost sets the theme, it does the necessary landscaping. So it draws our attention to a range of pertinent themes relating to the Indian state, particularly the post-colonial state, but it also historicizes, so we also get into the colonial state and then talk about the post-colonial state. Now, for example, if you think about, so it begins with a very interesting note that if you look at the overall mandate or the overall, I should say the overall premise, the cardinal principle of constitutional democracy, and Tanveer Bhai has borrowed from Sunil Khilnani that the idea is, so there is always a certain inclination towards preventing the worse. And you know, this achieving the good can always wait, but preventing the worse is top priority. Now, it of course looks like something that is great, and when you read, of course, you find a certain solace in that idea, but this can always be misappropriated. This entire sentiment can always be hijacked in times that are not truly democratic, and something that has definitely happened of late. So the very basis of constitutional democracy is that we must prevent the worst. Whether we end up attaining the good or not, doesn't matter, or it's not really top priority, but worse needs to be prevented, needs to be avoided. And this idea, so the question then is, although it is not explored in the book, but the question I think for us is, how does the state arrive at the understanding of what is worse? And I think that's what many of the chapters actually engage with. Although this question does not really figure in the chapters, but it does come across, as in there is this pursuit of this particular question. How does the state arrive at what is worse? What is the state's, what are the parameters on the basis of which the state figures it out that this is worse and needs to be prevented? And that's where the question of neutrality, the state neutrality, is something that we refer to repeatedly when we discuss secularism, religion, politics, interface, etc. That's where state neutrality gets questioned big time. So this idea about preventing the worse and not really getting bothered about attaining the good. So the foundation. So this, how does the state arrive at the worse? What kind of relativism does the state seek recourse to is something that we should be interested in. And particularly when we are talking about the times we live in, this question acquires more prominence, this question acquires more salience. Because we find ourselves in a situation, we find ourselves in a nation wherein the national common sense, unfortunately, is kind of a very weird, it's of a very awkward sort, the national common sense. So there are a few things about India as a nation that have almost acquired the stature of common sense here. This idea that, and I would want the author to also throw some light on this idea that India has always been tolerant. Right? Now, of course, India is always, when you say India or Indian, the implicit sort of argument is we are talking about ancient India, and of course if we are talking about ancient India, quite conveniently, a range of communities are immediately overlooked, excluded from this entire conception of a tolerant India. So I have come across many people, and I'm sure Tanveer Bhai and Parvez would agree with me. I find this a very annoying sort of phrase, that we've always been tolerant, as if tolerance has been part of the Indian civilization all along, ever since the civilization came into existence. What kind of politics does this lead to when we say we have always been tolerant? Now, when we say we have always been tolerant, it does not mean 100 years ago. The reference always is, Rig-Vedic, pre-Vedic, etc., age. And then when you go back all the way to 2000 BC, 2500 BC, of course the Christians, the Muslims, etc., are nowhere there in the picture. The religions did not exist, for heaven's sake. So how can the communities ever be part of that imagination of a tolerant Indian civilization? He really misses the point. Because for him, questions pertaining to state, margins, etc., they become very, very important questions. And more importantly, again, to go back to something that I pointed out a few minutes ago, the question of neutrality. Because the question of neutrality is absolutely central to the question of inter-community living, state, communities, association, religious freedom, liberty, etc. The other thing that is also important is there is a reference to this idea of the public. And again, the author takes it up, but I just want to kind of push it a bit in the introduction itself. So whenever we refer to the idea of the public, and if I were to borrow from, again, a problematic thing to do, but just for argument's sake, if I have to borrow from Western European thinkers and look at a certain Enlightenment conception of the public, now the public was always considered as something that was different from the mass, right? Now I know I'm getting into some sort of an elitist reading of the mass, but there are interesting works that look at how, if we do not remain a public, and if we are turned into a mass, then we are in for what we call totalitarianism. So there's a brilliant work, The Power Elite by C. Wright Mills. And in that particular work, there's a chapter, if I remember correctly, if memory serves me right, the last chapter, which is titled The Mass Society. And Mills, in 1956, is making an absolutely prophetic argument. He says that when publics turn into masses, of course he has already seen whatever has happened in Western Europe in the 30s and 40s particularly. And he sees when the public is turned into a mass, so basically when there is no conversation, there is no exchange between those who are on the other side of the power, whatever line, and those who are on this side, then you are in for bad news. Then this is totalitarianism, this is fascism, this is tyranny of majority, whichever way you want to express it. Right? So we have to also think about this. I think, unfortunately, in India, we are almost around, it's almost around the corner, as we say. India, we don't know whether in India we really have a public. Because the author also points out this very important concern that, all kinds of violent things are happening again and again and again, and there is no public outcry. So there is outcry. Things have not really gotten that dark. There is an outcry, but these are usual suspects. These are people who are basically speaking for the rights of everyone. So they are speaking for the rights of people of indigenous communities, they are speaking for environment, they are also speaking against lynchings, or they are speaking against violence committed, or violence perpetuated against minorities, Dalits, etc. So there is no public outcry in that sense. You really don't see a massive, huge, popular unrest against these acts that are absolutely violent. There are no two opinions about the fact that these are absolutely anti-constitution and these are anti-human rights, and this is very much against the very spirit of what we call democratic existence. So how do you, then following that, what to make of state practices of the most unacceptable sort when we do not have, as it is conceptualized in writings on democracy and engagement. So basically, again, the state, this is something that I decipher, and I don't know whether the author really implies this, but there is a certain disconnect between democracy as a practice and state being a certain kind of an enabler of that practice. And again, democracy as an idea. So we don't really have that kind of a sort of a connection between democracy as an associated mode of living, as John Dewey would say. And Ambedkar has also used the same phrase. And the experience of associated mode of living in day-to-day life. And once again, state practices are responsible in that disconnect, in that lack of experience on our part. The other thing is, the author thankfully does not get into a very usual trope in academia, which is about what we call good old days, right? Very often when people speak about the terrible times that we are in, we invariably speak about the not so terrible times that we were in earlier. So there is always a certain kind of a nostalgia that there was a Nehruvian consensus, that in the 50s things were not that bad, when Gandhi was around things were not that bad, etc., etc. So there is always this phrase, the good old days. The author does not really indulge in that. The author, of course, goes back to the past, but it's a more informed sort of, shall we say, going back. So the author is studying the past, particularly through various judicial proceedings, particularly. But the study of the past is not to kind of undertake any relativism, that the past was great, the present is terrible. The study of the past is simply to make sense of the present, and also to make sense of a certain unfolding, as we say. That how did we arrive here? What exactly happened over the years, over the decades, as a result of which we find ourselves in a situation that is bordering irredeemable, right? So that is another thing that I thought I would share with you. Then there is also, when we speak about the Indian state, we tend to, again, when I say we, of course there are exceptions to this, this statement, but most of us tend to think of the Indian state as something that just sort of suddenly descended from the heavens and started operating. What we must also understand is that this was very much a certain kind of a continuation, in ways more than one, of the colonial state. So there were remnants of the colonial state, and the IBC, of course, is an important reference in that regard. There are many provisions in law that many legal experts have pointed out are hopelessly, shamelessly colonial, yet they remain, and they remain with utmost confidence, right, with utmost assertion. So very often when we think of the state, we think of it as if it's something that just emerged one fine day in the 1940s, late 40s. But that's not really the case. The post-colonial state cannot be dissociated from the colonial state. And there are, of course, there are scholars who have written about this. There's David Scott, there are people like Trajectories, etc., who have kind of drawn our attention to a certain kind of colonial governmentality that also spills around after India's independence. The other thing, and this was surprisingly missing in, and I'm sure not intentionally, Ashish Nandi wrote a fantastic piece, and those of you who've done political sociology might already have read this piece. It's titled The Political Culture of the Indian State. It came out in 1982, if, again, memory serves me right. Daedalus is the journal. Now, Nandi actually writes about the practices of the state, and brilliantly, again. Nandi's overall argument around, and his argument is that the state ideally should have a certain sort of demarcated territory. And this he's writing about in 1980s. And he says what is actually happening is that the state is kind of expanding. And it is expanding and encroaching upon the society. And he's almost predicting that it might not be surprising that in the near future, the state becomes the society. Meaning there is hardly any social sphere left. The state is everywhere. The state kind of encroaches upon every possible social realm. And that's again to do with the practice of the state, that the state will not let you live on your own. The state is going to make interventions. The state is going to kind of enter into our lives through various mechanisms. Of course, of most prominence, of utmost prominence is what we call surveillance. All right, now, just to kind of come to, there is just one more reference, because there's a very meaningful borrowing from this fantastic collection, Anthropology of the State, of the Margins of the State, Deborah Pohl and Veena Das's edited volume. But what is important is there is also a piece by Talal Asad which is about the margins. And once again, it speaks to us directly. Again, an old piece, but once again, talking about how the margins invariably have to be there. There is no modern state that can operate without the margins. That is the thesis. You cannot have a nation state without the margins. A nation state will always find one margin on another. Today you have margin A, tomorrow you will have margin B, and so on. Let me just say 2-3 things because I've already been told to conclude. I hope I haven't said anything controversial. Okay. No, that was on a lighter note, sorry. So just to speak, just 2-3 things about politics of the sacred cow. Again, the question of neutrality. And let me just, of course it's a brilliant chapter and I'm doing great disservice to discussing this chapter by just summarizing it in 2-3 statements. But just one pointer which I think definitely deserves our attention. You see, whenever any communal move presents itself as brazenly communal, there is something that you can always do about it because it's there in the public knowledge and we can always counter it in whichever ways. These could be meager moves, these could be powerful interventions. But the question arises when there is a quote-unquote secular move that ends up facilitating a certain kind of communal politics. And this is something that Tanveer Bhai is invested in this particular chapter. That there are all kinds of secular arguments that are given in relation to ban around cow slaughter. So for example, cruelty against animals. Now this is of course a very secular argument, right? Animal rights is of course a secular ground. Similarly, animal husbandry. This idea of complete diversion from what we call faith and devotion to animal husbandry, etc. So when something is outrightly, brazenly communal, there is always something that could be done about it. But what do we do about so-called secular arguments that are given and that invariably end up facilitating communal politics, communal communal feeling